lot of what I'm going to talk about is identity and where and who you are putting your faith or who you're relying on. All right. This isn't some brand new revelation or topic that I've come up with. Right. It's everybody who's been to Awaken for 5 minutes has probably heard somebody talk about identity. All right. What I'm going to try to do is put a military spin on that. All right. And so whether that is somebody who is serving, whether that's a spouse, identity can become we can become very wrapped up in that in the military. Right. I know that when I got out of the military, that was my identity for probably 10 years. Right. And it can be good. It can also be bad. Right. But I want to kind of highlight some of the different things that we can fall into, traps that we can fall into. Right. And then we'll kind of go from there. Does that sound good? All right. Awesome. All right. Oh, boy. All right. Burpees are coming. All right. So first talking about identity, right? The main set of optics that we want to look through is that we are all either adopted sons or daughters of the King, right? That's our lineage. That's who our Heavenly Father is, right? So irregardless of what's happening here on earth, irregardless of who your earthly father is, irregardless of who your boss is, irregardless of any of that, we know who we belong to, and we need to keep that in mind. Grab some food. All right. All right, so first we're going to talk a little bit about Moses. All right, so remember Moses was born and kind of sailed down the river by his mom, right? And that was the only option that she really had to keep him alive, right? And so he was ultimately pulled out of the river by Pharaoh's daughter, right? So he went from being a slave, born as a slave and abandoned, orphaned, right, to being magically pulled, and they're Egyptians, so we can say magically, pulled out of the Nile, and he went from being an orphan to being raised in the palace, right? And it was because, hey, did you guys bring the kiddos? Did you already get them dropped off? All right, thank you. He went from being an orphan to being in the palace, and that was ultimately, right, God knows what he's wanting to have happen. He's putting things in place for things to happen in the future. So Moses spent 40 years being raised in the palace. He had 40 years to know what it was like to lead, what it was like to be royalty, to what it was like to essentially be a son of the king, right? And what that ultimately did is it was an identity shift that allowed him to step into the leadership to lead Israel out of Egypt, okay? That is the identity that we have ultimately inherited through Christ, all right? We need to think like a son and a daughter of the king in order to access all those benefits. All right, and so whether that be at work, in the military, out of the military, whether that be with family, whether that be with kids, whatever that is the mindset and the way that we need to look at different problems that come up with us. The second person that really highlights some of this is Joseph. All right, Joseph was the favored son, and he was sold into slavery. Right? Initially, they're just going to leave him in the ditch, and they realized, hold on, we might get a couple bucks to go to McDonald's on the way home, so let's sell him to the caravan. Right, so he went from faithfulness into slavery. He ended up in charge of Potiphar's house. Right, so he went from the bottom to the top. He walked in integrity, right, and that's a military value that we hear all the time. Then he was falsely accused of rape by Potiphar's wife, thrown back in prison. Right, with that, it cost him comfort, but he was able to preserve his character through that. He was able to maintain his integrity through that situation. Then he went from the prison to the palace, right? And he did that by remaining faithful to God. That was the backbone of that. He never forgot who he belonged to, and he never turned his back on God, right? So when he interpreted dreams, he was able to get the Pharaoh's cupbearer restored, right? Taken from prison back into his position, and he still had to wait 2 more years on top of that. He still sat in prison in awful conditions for 2 more years before he was called out of that. And so he sat there in prison, and it was a preparation, where preparation met opportunity for him. All right? And then he went through testing and forgiveness, right? His brothers and his family came from Israel to Egypt with the famine, and he ultimately chose forgiveness over revenge, right? And so what that ultimately did was the forgiveness of that broke generational dysfunction, right? And that's one of the earlier examples of real breaking of generational curses, generational dysfunction. But ultimately, all of that was all part of God's plan. Just as we saw that with the story with Moses, where he was able to lead an entire group of what would best be called misfits from Egypt into the promised land, or to the promised land, right? Joseph also was able to preserve the bloodline that ultimately Jesus Christ would come from. Right? So through all of this, all these trials and all the tribulation and everything he went through, it prepared him to be in a position that he could give forgiveness, he could grant that, he could extend that to his brothers and to his family, ultimately save that line. Right? Had that not happened, I don't know if we'd all be hanging out here, right? Because we would have killed that bloodline. But God knows what he's doing. So with that, a verse that kind of goes along with this, summing this up, is Galatians 4:7. Therefore, you are no longer a slave, but a son of God. And if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. All right, so that's kind of framing identity. All right, so from here, what I really want to do is I want to put a little military slant on this. So we have King Saul and we have King David, right? Two warriors, two kings, two people who have gone out, they fought, they got their share of scraps. And neither of them were anywhere close to being perfect. Right? So comparing and contrasting the two of them with their identity and with where their reliance fell could be some very good examples for us to either look back at our past and move away from that into restoration and into what God has for us. And it also gives us the ability to apply those same optics to what somebody could currently be going through or what somebody is going to go through in the future, right? We know that we are tested, we get through that, and we keep getting tested. Right? Has anyone experienced that before? I have, for sure. All right. So King Saul, his identity was very unstable, and it was very externally driven. Very externally driven. He was chosen by God. He was anointed by Samuel, right? But this was not, he ultimately wasn't God's plan, right? God didn't want Israel to have a king. He wanted them to have judges, but he gave them a king because they kept crying about it, right? And so Saul never settled into what God said he was. Constantly compared himself to others, especially throughout all of both books of Samuel. He constantly comparing himself against David. All right, comparison can be a real issue, right? And we can see that throughout the military, right? Anyone who's been in the military, I guarantee you've compared yourself to somebody else. It's a thing in the military, right? Comparing yourself against another person who has the same pay grade as you or has the same position as you, and why is this jackwagon? You can say that because Pastor Jurgen does. Why does this jackwagon get to have these privileges? Why didn't I get selected from this? Comparison can be poison, right? Comparison also can be good, right? It's like a gun can be good, a gun can also be bad. A sword can be good, a knife can be good, but it also has the other side of the blade too, right? And so comparison is not good when you let that start to become your identity and you let that start to impact your identity. But when you're using comparison to say, if David and I have the same position, right, and David is constantly getting promoted, he's given opportunities, etc., and I can either get really resentful over David and like, what is this guy? Why is he getting all this? David sucks at his job, blah, blah, blah. Or I could look at this and be like, what is he doing that I'm not? I'm comparing my performance to his, looking to see how I can get better, right? That's the double-edged sword, all right? So with that, Saul's sense of worth rose and fell with public opinion and success, all right? And so when performance, which is ultimately what that is, becomes our focal point, we end up going down a road that we don't necessarily want to go down. It's not going to bear as much fruit as it could. All right, so a couple stories with Saul. So punishing the Amalekites. Anyone say that 3 times fast? That too, Amalekites. Thank you. We're going to mispronounce some things today. All right, so 1 Samuel 15, Saul is instructed, now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, oxen and sheep, camel and donkey. Right? So Saul went and he attacked them, and he defeated them. Right? And then we pick up in verse 9, but Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were not willing to destroy them utterly, but everything despised and worthless that they utterly destroyed. We skip to verse 13. Then Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. But Samuel said, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? And Saul said, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. So he's partially doing what God's doing. There's a lot of different people that would argue that it wasn't necessarily Saul who said, let's not kill this guy, or let's not slay all the sheep, but we want some spoils of war. And Saul was more concerned about what the men underneath him would have to say about that, right? I would also say Saul probably wanted to bring Agag back and have a little bit of fun with that. All right. So with that, why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why do you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said to Samuel, but I have obeyed the voice of the Lord and have gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me and brought back Agag, king of Amalek, and I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the plunder, sheep and oxen, and the best of things, which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord of Gilgal. So he got caught doing it by Samuel, and then all of a sudden his story starts to change a little bit. Right? Have we seen that in the military? Right? You're the good idea fairy, right? You're starting to work something, no one's really looking, and all of a sudden maybe a senior chief sees it or a platoon sergeant sees it, and they're like, oh, hold on, it was for this. It was for this. It wasn't for me, right? Like we've all seen that type of stuff, right? That's now we're coming into integrity, right? So he blamed others instead of taking ownership, right? How many of you have ever really screwed something up and got caught doing it? I have, right? How well does it go for you when you just simply own it? It goes really well. How well does it go for you when you start making, no, not making excuses. I'm giving the reasons why making excuses, right? How well does that go for you? It doesn't go well for you at all. That works with your wife. You want to know the fastest way to get your wife to stop talking and being mad at you? Tell her it's your fault and own it. And then she has nowhere to go with this. I've learned this in my own marriage. If Christy was here, she would be laughing, but she's at a performance with our oldest daughter right now. So own it. Take ownership of things, right? That doesn't mean you're free from consequences, but the consequences will tend to be far less when you take that ownership. So we continue in chapter 22, verse 22. So Saul said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of the rams. All right, so with that, the big verse in this is 23. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. All right, so that was the final straw in a whole list of things that Saul had managed to perform over the book of Samuel 1 that had his kingship actually rescinded or stripped away from the Lord because it was given to him by God initially. All right, and that ultimately in verse 24, there's a very powerful line. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. All right, so he was more concerned about what the people were going to have to say than he was about pleasing God and about being obedient to God. Does that make sense? Okay. So with that, Saul's downfall shows that a calling without being rooted in identity leads to insecurity and disobedience. Right? The calling can be to the military, right? I'm not going to ask, but if you're the person who signed up for the military because you're going to jail, I want to know afterwards because I don't know anyone who's actually had to do that since like the 80s. Right? So what that means is, in general, everybody who signed on the dotted line, you made a choice to do that. Right? It could have been, I don't have a lot of other options, so I'm going to make a choice to do this instead of something else. Or you could have felt called to that. But a calling without it being rooted in identity is going to lead to the insecurity and to disobedience. Who has felt insecure in the military before? Right? Who has felt like they are being disobedient in the military, whether it be to a chain of command or to God or to your identity or your values? Right? There's compromising situations. All right. So being rooted as a son or a daughter of the king provides you with that foundation that you can always fall back upon. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So then when we look at King David, David's identity was settled before his position ever changed. Right? He knew who he was in God long before he was ever king, long before he was ever anointed as king. He saw himself first as God's servant, not as a public figure. And he identified his identity was internal and covenant-based, not performance-based. Right? Saul was very performance-based. David was not. Right? And so David was not prepared for kingship in a palace like Moses was, but he was prepared in a field. He had a whole bunch of sheep. He had a whole bunch of solitude. He had a whole bunch of worship. We have an entire book of Psalms, right? And he fought a lot of hidden battles, right? We know about two. He killed the lion and he killed the bear, right? We know of other battles once he started stepping into what God had for him. But there's a whole bunch of other stories, I would imagine, that when he was a shepherd, that he had to go do, whether it be fight off an animal, rescue a sheep, whatever that may be. So that was the preparation field. So the question for you guys to think about is, where are you being hidden for preparation? Right? Pastor Samuel, who's the campus pastor at Bressie, wrote a great book, which was The Process of Promotion. Has anyone seen that book or read that? If you have not, find that book. That is an absolutely amazing book. What he is talking about is everybody wants to be promoted. Everybody wants to be seen. Everybody wants to be recognized. And a lot of times before you're ready for it. Right? And so David was being prepared to become king and to lead while he was being hidden away as a shepherd boy. All right. And so what are you being hidden from? What could you potentially feel like you're being cheated out of? What could you be feeling like you missed out on? But God has you basically being hidden away because he's still working on preparing you. All right. So God develops private victories before you end up with a public platform. Right? That's the biggest thing. So what David learned: courage in isolation, faith through experience, and dependence on God in real danger. Right? And so all of that prepared him. The shepherd fields were his sanctuary, and this is where ultimately his sonship and his identity was formed. That's mood lighting. Nope. Okay. You never know with King David. Bible humor? I don't know. Thank you. I at least got one laugh. All right. So his authority flowed from intimacy with the Father, and his integrity came out of his heart before it came from a skilled hand. All right. So when he was anointed as king, right, Samuel goes to Bethlehem. He asks Jesse, "Hey, I want to see all your sons." 7 of them appear. Right. So Samuel is going down the line. He looks at the first son, Eliab. Anyway, Eliab, whoop, got that one. Looks at a big, strong, strapping dude, kind of looks like Garrett or maybe one of you guys here. And Saul's looking at him going, this has got to be the guy, right? And the Lord said, nope. Right, so 1 Samuel 16:7, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his height of stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as a man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Right? And so that is where ultimately Samuel looks at the other 6, passes them all by. Right? And so then Samuel asks Jesse, is this all the kids? Right? Is there somebody else? He's like, oh, we got the little runt out in the field. Let's go get him. Right? So they ultimately bring David by. David, in general, was thought to not be a legitimate son of Jesse and his wife. You guys know what ruddy means? Anyone? Redhead, right? He was like a carrot top. So I learned that one day. So he sent and brought him in. Now he was a ruddy with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, arise and anoint him, for this is the one. Right? And that was, we can go to Psalms where it talks about David was the man after God's heart. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. All right. So he wasn't even invited to the event at first, but he was being faithful well before it was being visible to everybody, and God saw him before man did. All right. So with that, the field was not delay; it was simply training. All right. So where are you currently being hidden? Where are you being developed? Where is training taking place? Whether this is in the military, whether this is looking for a husband or a wife, whether this is wanting to have children, whether this is in the marketplace and you're wanting to start a business, maybe that's been put on your heart. Maybe it's you're wanting a promotion. Maybe you're wanting to make a shift in career. Whatever that is, where are you being hidden while you're being developed? All right. So David shows that God builds identity in the secret place before releasing authority in public. All right. That is a theme that you will hear all day long. Right. You see people. Has anyone seen Rex Crane? Right. You've seen Pastor Jurgen, you've seen Pastor John, you've seen certain people where they come and they pray for people and just like mass casualty event, right? What you're seeing happening there is not a result of them standing necessarily in front of somebody and the words that are coming out of their mouth, right, while they're praying specifically for somebody. What that is a result of is all of the time spent in the quiet place. That is all a result of developing a very intimate relationship with God, with Jesus, and with the Holy Spirit, because they have that very deep well that they can then pull from to release that power. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So Saul lived as king by title, not as by son who trusted the father. His identity was very fragile. David lived in sonship first, kingship second. So some key takeaways from this. First part with identity, your hidden prayer life builds your public authority. All right. Getting on your knees at night and praying is a very simple act, but it's also something that's very easy to do. Right? How many of you, I did this before coming to Awaken, how many of you you get in bed and you get comfortable and you'd be like, start praying, and about 38 seconds later you fell asleep, right? How many of you have done that before? I did that, right? And I'm like, yeah, I probably don't want to do that, right? Like, God might want to hear more than 38 seconds worth, right? So there's simple things with developing your prayer life, right? There are all kinds of there is no one way to pray, right? You hear different stories about the way people pray. You hear Pastor Morgan talk where he has to walk in order to really burn off energy, is the way he describes it, before he's able to really hear from God. Pastor Jenny literally goes in a spare room they have, sits on a chair, cozy blanket, all the things, music, and that's how she does that, right? My wife runs and hears this, which is just bizarre to me, right? I like walking, right? So everyone has their different way of doing this, right? You just got to find the one that is really allowing you to hear from the Lord. Leading a few things, a few people, a few responsibilities well prepares you to lead many, right? So we've heard a lot of people talk about stewardship, right? We've seen there's parables, all kinds of parables in the New Testament where the parable of the talents, right? I can trust you with little, I can trust you with much, right? And so it's the same thing, right? Whether if we're talking about the military, right? Everybody's going to start off as an E something that's a low number, or you're going to start off as a dumbass second lieutenant, and you don't know anything, right? And so they give you just a little bit of things. I say that out of personal experience, being that guy. They give you like a few things. They're like, here, don't break this. Don't lose your rifle. Try not to get your platoon lost, right? Like stuff like that. And then as you develop, they start trusting you with more, and they start trusting you with more, and they start trusting you with more. So it's the stewardship a little. In business, it could be you start a new job and they give you some responsibility. And then once you've stewarded that well, you've done that well, they give you more, and they give you more, and they give you more. Right? So this is a constant thing. This is also, it plays out just like that in marriage, right? It plays out like that in relationships, right? And so as we've known each other, what, for like 2-3 years, right? So when David and I first met each other, we're like, he's not a bad guy, but I don't know David. And he's like, hey, can I help with this? I'm like, sure, do that, right? I don't remember what it was, but it wasn't just like, I need you to send out the Evite, I need you to do X. I was like, hey, do one thing. Right? And David has consistently shown over and over and over and over again that I can trust him with things, right? And so that is something that he has stewarded small things well. Now he stewards big things. Discipline in the small things strengthens you for bigger fights, right? Discipline in the small things can be the small things at work. It can be the small things like me remembering to put my bowl in the dishwasher instead of the sink. It started off as getting it in the sink. Right? It was going from the counter to the sink was a big deal to my wife. And then we progressed. I stewarded the sink well. So now I steward the dishwasher, right? And so they're little things, right? This can also be things like picking up your laundry. This can be things like checking your CRM. This can be things like making sure that your men have what they need. This can be making sure that whatever it is with the small things, this can be getting out of bed earlier in the morning so you can go work out before your family wakes up. It's taking care of the small things, because when you have discipline there, again, you're going to have discipline in big things. Intimacy with God will qualify you for influence with other people, and the oil flows where character already exists. That makes sense? Okay. We're going to go faster through reliance of God. All right, so King Saul relied on himself when pressure came. He feared people more than he feared God. He offered sacrifices when he was not authorized to give them. And he acted impulsively when waiting for God felt too costly. All right, so summarizing instead of reading a bunch of scriptures. So he raids and defeats the Philistines at the garrison of Geba. Right? The Philistines hear about this and they're like, okay, we got something for you. And so they start gathering. So you got Saul and the Israelites in Gilead. And you got a whole bunch of Philistines, like 30,000 of them, chariots, all the whole thing. You're like, this is not going well, right? This is like he was Iraq, and Saul and the Philistines were the American army in 1991. It's like, this is not going to end well for him, right? And so what he was told is, hey, you wait for Samuel. He's going to take 7 days. He'll be here. He will make a sacrifice, and God will deliver you from this, right? He got to the 7-day mark, and there's no Samuel. Where is Samuel? Where is Samuel? His men are hiding in caves. His men are deserting. He's got people leaving and going to foreign lands. People are like, I'm out. We're not going to get our rear ends kicked here. And so he listens to the fear of men. He listens to the concern his men have. And what Saul does is he ultimately decides, I am being forced now to make this sacrifice on my own. So he goes ahead and he makes a sacrifice that he's not authorized to give. So with that, Samuel shows up probably like a half hour later, and he's like, what are you doing? And so out of verse 12, 1 Samuel 13:12, he says, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord, so I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. Right? So it was relying upon himself, trying to force something to happen, versus relying upon God. Right? How many of you have tried forcing things? How many of you tried forcing things in a relationship? Right? Doesn't work well. Right? How about forcing things at work? Forcing things in business? Forcing things in a relationship? Doesn't work. It doesn't work, right? And ultimately, it didn't work for Saul, right? So self-reliance often masquerades as responsibility, but is also rooted in fear, all right? So for David, he was consistently inquiring of the Lord. He asked God before battles. He trusted God's timing, even when he was anointed but not enthroned, right? And so he repented quickly when he failed. So 2 stories with David, right? So there was this first story. He was being hunted by Saul. He was with the Philistines, and ultimately went out to go to battle. Ended up not getting into the fight. Came back, and the Amalekites. I'm saying that wrong again, huh? Amalekites. There we go. The Amalekites had come, and they had raided the town, and they took all the women, all the children, all the sheep, all the animals. Right? You guys remember this story? Right? And so one of the interesting parts of that, those are the same people that Saul failed to destroy. Same people. Same people. All right? So with that, a lot of David's men were like, we need to kill this dude. Like, he's totally screwed us. Like, our wives are gone, our kids are gone, like everything we had's gone. Like, this dude needs his butt kicked. And so David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So when everything was collapsing around him, families taken, city burned, reputation shaken, men turning on him, David inquired of the Lord, and he said, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? He, God, answered, pursue, for you shall surely overtake them and shall surely rescue. So he sought God's counsel. David didn't assume victory. He moved because God spoke. All right, he sought God's counsel. Ultimately, he chased them down, and they recovered every single woman, every single child, all of the livestock, all of the riches. The reliance on God restored completely. And then there was a second story where, again, he waved. Oh, there we go. All right, I don't know whether that was me or David, but we got it to work. All right, there was another story where when David inquired with the Lord, shall I go up and attack them? He said, you shall not go up, but go around to their rear and come against them opposite the balsam trees. Right? David did as the Lord commanded and struck down the Philistines from Geba to Gezer. Right? So a couple different examples there. Dependence on God keeps the authority aligned with the heavens. Okay. How do we access the authority of God? Prayer. Right? All right, so Saul leaned on control and optics. He leaned on human approval. David leaned on prayer, worship, and obedience. Right? 2 very different approaches to things. Right? Every single person, me included, has gone both of those directions. Right? I can tell you out of personal experience which one tends to work better. Right? And I would imagine that all of you can also. So some key takeaways with this, kind of wrapping the whole thing up. Fatigue can cause you to reason in your heart instead of inquiring with the Lord. Right? Those of you that have been in the military, have you ever been tired before? Yeah. Those of you that have kids, have you ever been tired before? Yes, right? Those of you that own a business, have you been tired before? Yes. Those of you that have had a job, have you ever been tired before? Yes. Right? So everybody in here has been tired? All right. So that can cause you to reason in your heart, reason in your mind, instead of inquiring of the Lord. All right. So recognizing that, grabbing a hold of that, grabbing that thought captive, and submitting that to the Lord. When God gives direction, you will move more confidently. The outcome rests on His word. The strength to fight follows strengthening yourself in the Lord, right? All kinds of story after story in the Bible. Compromise eventually affects those closest to you, right? Compromise, right? We've all heard stories of compromise being if I'm needing to go this way, I go 180 degrees, right? Like some major, huge compromise, right? Those are obvious. Those are things that are really bad. But also the compromise that really tends to be the thing that accumulates is you hit the snooze button 3 or 4 times. You decide that the warm, comfortable bed I'm sleeping in is going to be a lot more warm and comfortable than me going to the gym to pick up stupid heavy things and put them back down, right? It can be, well, I don't need to make the last set of phone calls. I'm going to go spend time with my kids, right? It could be, I don't really need to clean this piece of equipment. I don't need to really report this issue. Whatever that is, those small, seemingly in a vacuum compromises that if they are in a vacuum, meaning there's nothing else, they're not affecting anything and nothing is affecting them, that small little compromise doesn't matter. But in the real world, we don't live in a vacuum. So these small little compromises start to add up. Does that make sense? Okay. God cares about families. He cares about restoration, right? You can show up for 5 minutes and hear about that at Awaken. You hear about that, what God does. Burnout leads to poor decisions. Strength is maintained in prayer, and stay planted where God has you called, right? So burnout. How many of you have been burnt out in the military? Right? At least once for about 5 minutes. How many of you have been burnt out in marriage? Parenting, right? I know there's at least 3 moms in here that have experienced that, right? If my wife was here, she'd be number 4, right? But being burnt out can lead to poor decisions, right? Being tired and burned out can lead to poor decisions. A poor decision could be using a tone of voice that's not in alignment with who you are, right? It could be saying something to a kid. It could be saying something to a spouse that you don't really mean. It just comes out while you're angry. It comes out while you're tired. It comes out while you're burnt out, right? And so taking that to the Lord, staying planted where God has you, right? I'm fairly confident that God has everybody in this room right about where He wants you. That doesn't mean that this is where you're going to stay, right? But it is right now where God has you with whatever that is you're going through. He has you here for a reason, right? And that reason isn't to keep you here and to punish you, but that reason could be development. That reason could be pulling other people up with you, all right? So the enemy takes temporarily, but when God speaks and you obey, you're going to recover everything. That makes sense?